In the winter of 1904, deep in the Missouri Ozarks, a traveling photographer named Samuel Garrett made a discovery that would haunt him until his dying day. While documenting abandoned buildings for a historical society, he entered the old Harlow County Jail, a structure that had been sealed and forgotten for over a decade. What he found inside wasn't just evidence of cruelty or neglect. It was something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and infinitely more terrifying. Between the outer and inner walls of certain cells, Samuel discovered hollow spaces. And in those hollow spaces, he found them. Prisoners who had simply vanished from the records. Men and women who had been reported as escaped or transferred but who had never left the building at all. They had been sealed inside the walls while still breathing, their final moments preserved in the limestone and mortar. Their hands were frozen in clawing positions. Their mouths locked open in eternal silent screams. But here's what kept Samuel awake every night afterward: some of those walls were less than 2 inches thick. Thin enough that the prisoners could hear everything happening in the cells. Thin enough that the guards could hear them screaming, scratching, begging. 4 days. Sometimes weeks. This is the true story of the Harlow County Jail, where punishment didn't end with death, it began there. If you're fascinated by dark history and true horror stories that time tried to bury, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because the stories I uncover get darker, stranger, and more disturbing with every episode. Don't let YouTube hide this from you. And if this story disturbs you, good. It should. Leave a comment telling me how far you made it, and share this with someone brave enough to listen. Now, let's descend into the darkness of 1904. Chapter 1: The Photographer's Commission. Samuel Garrett wasn't looking for horror when he accepted the commission from the Missouri Historical Preservation Society in January of 1904. He was a practical man, 42 years old, with a wife and 3 daughters waiting for him back in St. Louis. His assignment was simple: document the abandoned structures in Harlow County before they were demolished or reclaimed by the wilderness. The society wanted photographs, measurements, architectural notes, or record of frontier justice before it vanished entirely. Harlow County sat in a forgotten pocket of the Ozark Mountains, where winter fog clung to the valleys like something alive. The county had been prosperous once, back when the lumber trade was booming and the railroad pushed through. But by 1904, most of the population had moved on. The county seat, a town called Ashford's Creek, had dwindled to fewer than 300 souls. Many of the buildings stood empty, including the jail. The jail had been built in 1867, constructed from local limestone with walls 3 feet thick. It had served the county for nearly 30 years before being mysteriously abandoned in 1893. The official records stated it had been closed due to structural concerns and unsanitary conditions, but nobody Samuel spoke to seemed to know the real reason. The locals avoided it. When he asked for directions, people gave them reluctantly, and nobody offered to accompany him. "You're better off leaving that place alone," an old woman told him at the general store. Her name was Martha Prine, and she'd lived in Ashford's Creek her entire 71 years. Nothing good ever happened in that building. Nothing good remains there now. Samuel smiled politely and bought a lantern and extra oil. He'd heard superstitious warnings before. Every old building had its ghost stories. He arrived at the jail on a gray morning when the temperature hovered just above freezing. The structure sat at the edge of town, surrounded by bare trees and overgrown brush. It was smaller than he'd expected, a 2-story building with barred windows on both floors and a heavy iron door that hung partially open, its hinges rusted and screaming. The limestone walls were dark with moisture and age, streaked with mineral deposits that looked disturbingly organic, like veins beneath pale skin. Samuel set up his camera equipment in the clearing and took several exterior shots, noting the architectural details in his leather journal. Then he lit his lantern, pushed open the iron door, and stepped inside. The smell hit him immediately: damp stone, rot, and something else. Something sweet and wrong, like flowers left too long in a sealed room. The entry hall was narrow, with a guard stationed to the left and a heavy door straight ahead that led to the cell block. Debris littered the floor, broken furniture, scattered papers, a single boot lying on its side. He photographed the guard station first, then moved to the door leading deeper into the building. It took effort to pull it open. The hinges fought him, but eventually it gave way with a groan that echoed through the structure. The cell block beyond was a long corridor with cells on both sides, 6 in total, 3 to a side. The doors stood open. Iron bars were visible through each doorway, and beyond them, the small cells themselves. Maybe 8 feet by 6 feet each. Stone walls, stone floor, a single high window in each. No furniture remained except for rusted iron rings bolted to the walls, rings that would have held shackles. Samuel worked methodically, photographing each cell, taking notes on dimensions and construction. He was focused on the technical aspects, the architectural history. He wasn't thinking about the men and women who'd been confined here. He wasn't thinking about suffering. Not yet. It was in the 4th cell that he first noticed something strange. He'd set up his camera to photograph the back wall when his lantern light caught an irregularity in the stonework. The wall looked wrong. The limestone blocks didn't align quite right. There was a vertical seam running floor to ceiling, about 2 feet from the corner. It was subtle, easily missed in dim light, but once Samuel saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He approached the wall and ran his fingers along the seam. The mortar there was different, lighter in color, more crumbly. Newer. He knocked on the stone with his knuckles. The sound that came back wasn't the solid thunk he expected. It was hollow. Samuel's breath caught. A hollow space behind the wall. Perhaps a structural gap, or a place where repairs had been made. He moved along the wall, knocking, listening. The hollow sound continued for about 4 feet, then returned to solid stone. He was about to move on when he noticed something at the base of the wall, near the floor. Scratches. Deep gouges in the limestone, clustered around the seam. The pattern was chaotic, desperate. Like something, or someone, had clawed at the stone. From behind the wall, in that hollow space, came the faintest whisper of sound. Samuel froze, lantern held high, listening. Silence. Just the wind outside, the creak of the old building settling. He almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. But then he saw the crack, a thin horizontal fissure in the mortar, right at eye level. And behind that crack, in the darkness of the hollow space, he saw something that made his hands begin to tremble. A fingernail. Human. Still attached to withered, dried flesh. Someone was inside the wall. Chapter 2, The First Discovery. Samuel Garrett stumbled backward from the wall, his lantern swinging wildly and casting monstrous shadows across the cell. His mind struggled to process what he'd seen. A finger. A human finger, pressed against the crack in the mortar from inside the wall. Impossible. It had to be a trick of the light, a piece of debris, anything else. But he knew what he'd seen. His photographer's eye was trained to capture detail, to see what others missed. And there was no mistaking the curve of that fingernail, the texture of desiccated skin, the way it rested against the gap as if frozen in the act of scratching, clawing, trying desperately to break through. He forced himself to breathe, to think rationally. He was a man of science, of documentation. Whatever this was, it needed to be investigated properly. He set the lantern down carefully and retrieved a crowbar from his equipment bag. He'd brought it for prying open stuck doors. Returning to the wall, Samuel examined the scene more carefully. The mortar here was definitely newer than the surrounding stonework, probably no more than 10 or 15 years old. Someone had sealed this space deliberately. The scratches around the seam told a story he didn't want to read, but couldn't ignore. He wedged the crowbar into the seam and pulled. The newer mortar crumbled more easily than he'd expected. Chunks fell away, revealing the gap behind. The smell that emerged made him gag, not the overwhelming stench of fresh death, but something worse. The dry, dusty odor of something long dead, mummified, preserved in the darkness. Samuel worked faster now, his horror overwhelmed by a grim determination. He needed to know. Had to know. What had happened here? Who had done this? After 20 minutes of work, he'd created an opening large enough to shine his lantern through. The body was standing upright, wedged in the narrow space between the inner and outer walls. A man, or what remained of one. The corpse had been naturally mummified by the dry conditions inside the wall cavity. Skin like leather stretched over bone. Empty eye sockets. Mouth frozen open in a scream that had ended years ago. The man's hands were raised, fingers bent and broken from clawing at stone. His fingernails were worn to nothing, and the limestone around him was scored with scratch marks. But it was what Samuel saw around the corpse's neck that made his blood run cold, an iron collar, attached to a short chain bolted to the outer wall. The chain was only 2 feet long. This man hadn't been sealed in a wall after death. He'd been chained inside the cavity while alive, and then the wall had been bricked up around him. He'd been left to die in the darkness, standing upright, unable to sit or lie down, with just enough space to move his arms. To scratch uselessly at stone. To scream where only the guards could hear him. Samuel vomited in the corner of the cell, his breakfast spattering on the ancient floor. When he could move again, he grabbed his camera with shaking hands and photographed the opening, the body, every detail. Evidence. This was evidence of murder. Of something worse than murder. He had to tell someone. The sheriff, the historical society, someone in authority. This was a crime scene. These were human remains. Someone would need to investigate, to identify the victim, to find out who had done this and why. But first, he needed to check the other cells. The realization hit him like a physical blow. If this wall was hollow, if one prisoner had been sealed inside, how many others might there be? Samuel moved to the next cell, his lantern casting his elongated shadow before him. He began tapping on the walls, listening for that telltale hollow sound. The first wall was solid. The second was solid. The third. Hollow. And then he saw them. More scratches around another barely visible seam. Another section of newer mortar. Another grave sealed in stone. In the next hour, Samuel found 3 more hollow walls. 3 more bodies. Each chained. Each sealed and while alive. The second was another man, his skeleton collapsed at the bottom of the wall cavity, his chain had been longer, allowing him to slide down as weakness overcame him. The third was a woman, her desiccated corpse still wearing the remnants of a cotton dress. Her hands had been bound behind her back before she'd been walled in. The fourth was barely more than a boy, perhaps 16 or 17 when he died. His fingertips had been worn to bone from clawing. 4 people. 4 human beings sealed alive inside the walls of the Harlow County Jail, left to die in darkness and terror and absolute helplessness. Samuel sat on the floor of the corridor, his back against the cold stone, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't punishment. This was torture. This was evil given form in mortar and stone. Who had authorized this? Who had done the work? And most horrifying of all, how long had it taken for each of them to die? Days? Weeks? How long had they screamed before their voices gave out? How long had they scratched at the walls before hope finally died? He needed to leave. Needed to get back to town, to find the sheriff, to report this atrocity. But something made him pause. His eyes traveled to the ceiling, where a dark stairwell led to the second floor. If there were bodies down here, sealed in the walls of the first floor cells. Samuel didn't want to go upstairs. Every instinct screamed at him to flee this place of death, to run back to town, to never look back. But he was a thorough man. A documenter. And if there were more victims, they deserved to be found. To be acknowledged. To have their suffering witnessed. He picked up his lantern and climbed the stairs. The second floor was a mirror of the first, a corridor with cells on each side. But up here, the atmosphere felt different. Heavier. The air itself seemed thick with something invisible but oppressive, like the building was pressing down on him, watching him, waiting. Samuel checked the first cell. Solid walls. The second cell. Solid. The third. Hollow. With scratches. With a seam in the mortar. But this one was different. This wall was thinner, no more than 2 inches of stone between the cell and the hollow space. And when Samuel pressed his ear against it, he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A whisper. Faint. Rhythmic. Like breathing. Like something was still alive inside the wall. Chapter 3, The Impossible Sound. Samuel jerked away from the wall as if it had burned him, his lantern nearly slipping from his trembling hand. No. Impossible. These bodies had been sealed in for over a decade, based on when the jail was abandoned. Nothing could survive that long without food, without water, without light. But he had heard something. He was certain of it. The rational part of his mind offered explanations: wind moving through cracks in the stonework, the building settling, his own breathing echoed back to him. But the sound had been too rhythmic, too deliberate. It had sounded like whispering. Like words. He stood motionless in the cell, barely breathing himself, straining to hear. The silence stretched for a full minute. 2. 3. Nothing. Just the familiar sounds of the old building, the creak of wood, the drip of water somewhere, the wind outside. Then it came again. Please. Samuel's vision swam. The lantern slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor, but didn't go out. In its sideways light, the cell walls seemed to ripple and breathe. He grabbed the lantern and held it up to the wall with the seam, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep it steady. Hello? His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Is someone there? Silence. I heard you. I'm here to help. Please, answer me. Nothing. Just the hammer of his own heart, loud in his ears. Samuel pressed his ear against the cold stone again, listening with every fiber of his being. At first, nothing. Then, so faint he almost missed it, he heard it again. Not words this time, but a sound. Scratching. The slow, deliberate scrape of something moving against stone. Something was in there. Something was moving. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee this cursed place and never return. But he couldn't. If there was even the slightest chance someone was alive in there, trapped, suffering, he had a moral obligation to help them. Samuel ran down to his equipment and grabbed the crowbar. His mind raced as he climbed back up the stairs. If someone was alive, they'd need water immediately. Medical attention. How had they survived? It didn't make sense. Unless they'd been sealed in more recently. Unless whatever had happened here in the 1890s was still happening. Unless someone was still using this abandoned jail as a place of execution. Back in the second-floor cell, Samuel attacked the wall with the crowbar. The mortar here was even newer than downstairs. It crumbled almost easily, as if it had been placed within the last few years rather than a decade ago. He worked feverishly, fear giving him strength. The scratching sound had stopped, but he could feel something on the other side of the wall. A presence. Waiting. Within minutes, he'd created an opening large enough to shine his lantern through. The space beyond was empty. Samuel stared in confusion at the hollow cavity between the walls. No body. No chains. Just empty space about 18 inches wide, running the full height of the wall. Newer scratches covered the inner surface of the outer wall, fresh enough that stone dust still clung to some of them. But there was nothing there. Hello, he called into the cavity, his voice echoing strangely. Where are you? Movement. Not in the cavity in front of him, but behind him. In the cell. Samuel spun around, holding his lantern high. The cell was empty. The doorway stood open to the corridor beyond. Nothing moved. But he had heard something, he was certain. A shuffling. The sound of feet on stone. Who's there? His voice was stronger now, edged with anger covering his fear. Show yourself. The corridor outside the cell grew darker. Not gradually, but suddenly, as if something had snuffed out the daylight coming through the barred windows. His lantern seemed to dim, its circle of light shrinking. And then he saw it. At the far end of the corridor, where the stairwell descended into darkness, something stood. A figure. Man-shaped but wrong. Too thin. Too tall. Its proportions weren't quite human, arms too long, hanging past where its knees should be. It didn't move, just stood there, a deeper darkness against the dark. Samuel's rational mind tried to process what he was seeing. A trick of shadow. An optical illusion. His eyes adjusting to the dim light and creating patterns where none existed. But then it moved. Not walking. Not exactly. It flowed forward, like smoke given form, gliding across the floor without taking steps. As it came closer, Samuel could make out more details. The figure wore what might have been clothing once, rags hanging from an emaciated frame. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Samuel could see its hands. Long fingers, too many joints, ending in what looked like broken nails worn to nothing. The thing that had been scratching at the walls. Still scratching. Still trying to escape, even in death. Samuel backed into the cell, his mind screaming at his legs to run, but they wouldn't obey. The figure reached the doorway and stopped, as if held back by an invisible barrier. Up close, Samuel could see that it wasn't quite solid. He could make out the faint outline of the corridor through its form. And then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a dry whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Why did you open the walls?" Samuel's mouth moved, but no sound came out. "We were contained. Kept inside. Kept quiet. Why did you let us out?" I didn't." Samuel finally managed to gasp. "I was just documenting. I found bodies. I thought someone might still be alive." "Alive?" The figure tilted its head, and for a moment Samuel caught a glimpse of what might have been a face, empty eyes, a mouth open in an eternal scream. "We were alive. 4 days. Weeks. Some of us. We screamed until we couldn't scream. We scratched until our fingers were bone. We died in the dark, so close to the light we could hear it. Hear the guards laughing. Hear prisoners in the cells begging for mercy. We heard everything. Everything." The figure drifted closer, seeming to push through the invisible barrier. "And now the walls are open. Now we can hear everything again. Feel everything again. Do you understand what you've done?" Samuel couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure was inches away now, and he could feel cold radiating from it like winter fog. "We're not alone anymore," it whispered. "All of us. All the walls. We can feel each other now. We can move. We've been waiting so long." The figure reached out one impossibly long hand toward Samuel's face. And then, from everywhere at once, came the sound of scratching. Chapter 4, The Warden's Ledger. Samuel screamed and swung the crowbar through the apparition. It passed through the figure like smoke, connecting with nothing. The entity dispersed at the movement, fragments of shadow scattering like disturbed mist. The scratching sound stopped abruptly, plunging the corridor into absolute silence. He didn't wait to see if it would reform. Samuel grabbed his lantern and ran. He took the stairs 3 at a time, nearly falling in his panic. Behind him, he could hear sounds, soft at first, then growing louder. Whispers overlapping whispers. The scrape of fingernails on stone. The rattle of chains. All of it following him down the stairs, through the first-floor corridor, toward the exit. Samuel burst through the iron door into the gray morning light, gasping for air. He didn't stop running until he was 50 yards from the building, his lungs burning. Only then did he turn back to look. The jail sat silent and still. No shadows moved in the windows. No sounds emerged from within. It looked exactly as it had when he'd arrived, just an old, abandoned building slowly being reclaimed by time and wilderness. But Samuel knew better now. He knew what was inside. Not just bodies sealed in walls, but something else. Something that had been contained by those walls and was now free to move. He'd released them. By breaking open the seals, he'd let them out. Samuel gathered his equipment with shaking hands, loaded everything into his wagon, and rode back to Ashford's Creek. The town looked different now. Every building seemed to hide secrets, every shadow might contain horrors. He went straight to the sheriff's office, a small building on what passed for Main Street. Sheriff Tom Welker was a heavy-set man in his 60s with gray hair and suspicious eyes. He listened to Samuel's story with increasing skepticism, his expression shifting from interest to concern to something like pity. "Son," Welker said when Samuel finished, "I think maybe the isolation got to you out there. It's an eerie place, I'll grant you that. But ghosts? Bodies in the walls? That's quite a tale." "I have photographs," Samuel insisted. "I documented everything. The bodies are real, Sheriff. Someone sealed living people inside those walls. That's murder. Multiple murders." Welker sighed and leaned back in his chair. "All right. I'll ride out there with you tomorrow morning, take a look around. If there's bodies like you say, we'll handle it proper. But I'll be honest with you, the jail's been abandoned more than 10 years. If there was something wrong there, someone would have found it before now." "Why was it abandoned?" Samuel asked. "Nobody seems to want to talk about it." The sheriff's expression closed off. "Structural problems. Building wasn't safe. They built a new jail over in Clayton, moved the prisoners there. That's all there is to it." "But why?" "That's all there is to it," Welker repeated firmly. "Now, you're welcome to stay at the boarding house tonight. We'll head out to the jail first thing in the morning." Samuel wanted to press further, but he could see it would be useless. Instead, he asked, "Where would I find records about the jail? Prisoner logs, administrative documents?" Welker studied him for a long moment. "County Records Office, across the street. But Martha Prine keeps those files, and she's particular about who she lets see them. Especially about the jail." The same woman who'd warned Samuel away from the building that morning. He found Martha Prine at the County Records Office, a converted store with shelves lined with ledgers and document boxes. She was sorting through a stack of papers when Samuel entered, and her expression soured when she recognized him. "You went out there," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did. And I found something. Something terrible." Martha set down her papers slowly. "Then you should leave it be. Some things are meant to stay buried. There are bodies in the walls, Mrs. Prine. People who were murdered. Don't they deserve justice?" "Justice?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think there's justice for what happened in that place? You're 30 years too late, young man. The people responsible are long dead or gone. Then help me understand what happened. Please. I need to see the jail records. Prisoner logs, transfer orders, anything that might explain. Explain why they did it." Martha interrupted. She studied Samuel's face, seemed to come to some decision. "All right. You want to know? You want to understand? Come with me." She led him to a back room lined with older records. From a locked cabinet, she withdrew a single ledger, leather-bound and water-stained. She set it on the table between them with a heavy thump. "This is Warden Silas Blackwood's personal ledger," Martha said quietly. "The official records were destroyed when the jail closed. But this survived. My father was a deputy back then. He took it from Blackwood's office before they sealed the building. He gave it to me before he died, made me promise to keep it hidden." "Why?" Samuel asked. "Because of what's in it. Because of what it proves." Martha opened the ledger to a page marked with a ribbon. "Read." Samuel pulled the book closer and began to read Blackwood's cramped handwriting. March 3, 1891. The method proves effective. Prisoner 147, William Morse, horse theft, sealed in east wall, cell 3. Expired after 6 days. No evidence remains visible. Wall reinforced and plastered. The screaming was difficult for the men at first, but they adapt. We all adapt. Samuel's hands began to shake as he continued reading. April 17, 1891. Prisoner 163, Sarah Coldwell, prostitution and theft, sealed in West Wall, Cell 2. Provided longer chain to allow sitting. She expired after 13 days. Note, women take longer. Their screaming is more distressing. Consider reducing chain length. June 2, 1891. Prisoner 178, James Chen, vagrancy and insolence, sealed in North Wall, Cell 5. Chain length reduced as per previous note. Expired after 4 days. More efficient. The men no longer complain about the sounds. October 29, 1891. Prisoner 203, Marcus Cole, murder, sealed in East Wall, Cell 1, 2nd floor. This one deserves to suffer. Gave him maximum chain length. He lasted 3 weeks. By the end, he was no longer human. The sounds he made. Page after page of entries. Dates. Names. Methods. Clinical observations about how long each prisoner lasted, how loudly they screamed, how long it took for them to give up scratching at the walls. Silas Blackwood hadn't been a warden. He'd been a monster conducting experiments in torture, documenting the deaths of dozens of prisoners like a scientist recording data. Why? Samuel whispered. Why did he do this? Because he could, Martha said simply. Because he had absolute power over the prisoners in his care, and no one questioned what happened behind those walls. Men and women were sent to that jail, and sometimes they just disappeared. Marked as escaped or transferred. No one investigated. No one cared enough to ask questions. How many? Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Martha turned to the back of the ledger. 47. Over the course of 4 years. 47 people sealed alive in the walls of that jail. Samuel felt bile rise in his throat. What happened to Blackwood? Chapter 5, The Return. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He lay in his room at the boarding house, Silas Blackwood's ledger entries consuming his thoughts. 47 people tortured to death in darkness, their suffering documented like scientific data. And he'd broken open their tombs. Around 3 in the morning, scratching sounds drifted through his window. Faint at first, then louder. Not from outside, from inside the walls of his room. Moving. Circling. Following the building's structure toward him. They had found him. Samuel grabbed his belongings and fled. The corridor was empty, but scratching echoed from every wall, every surface. An orchestra of fingernails on wood and plaster. The sounds were meant for him alone, the night clerk heard nothing. He realized the truth, whatever he'd released was connected to him now. He was the one who'd broken the seals. At dawn, Samuel convinced Sheriff Welker to return to the jail. The lawman was skeptical until he saw the first body sealed in the wall. Then the second. The third. By the time they reached the 2nd floor, both men were shaking. Who did this? Welker demanded. Warden Silas Blackwood. Martha Prine's ledger, he documented everything. The temperature plummeted without warning. Frost formed on the walls. The scratching began, soft, then urgent. The sound of dozens of hands clawing at stone. Shadows moved in the cells. Figures emerged, tall, thin, wrong. 7 spirits stood in the corridor, bearing the marks of their deaths. Broken fingers. Chains around necks. Mouths frozen in silent screams. One drifted forward. Samuel recognized it from the day before. You wanted to understand, it whispered. Feel what we felt. The spirit reached out, and cold sank into Samuel's chest. Images flooded his mind, memories that weren't his own. He experienced being sealed in a wall. The absolute darkness. The chain around his neck. The final brick being laid, hope dying with the light. Days of thirst becoming torture. Scratching stone until fingers broke. Screaming until his voice was gone. The slow descent into madness. And through it all, sounds from outside. Guards laughing. Other prisoners begging. The warden's footsteps. The scratch of his pen, documenting another successful experiment. Samuel collapsed, gasping. The vision released him, but the echo of suffering remained. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Sorry changes nothing," the spirit said. "But you opened the walls. Gave us space to move. For the first time in years, we're not contained. We can spread through this building. Through the town. Through every wall and shadow." More figures emerged from the cells. 7 spirits now, all marked by their deaths. "We're not asking permission," they said. "This place took everything from us. Now we take from it. From the town that let it happen. The people living here now had nothing to do with this," Samuel protested. "They built their lives on top of our suffering. They'll feel it now." The spirits began gliding toward the stairs. As the last one passed, Samuel called out, "Wait! What happened to Blackwood? What happened to the warden?" All 7 spirits stopped. Turned. Their empty eyes fixed on Samuel. "You want to know?" the first spirit asked. "Come. We'll show you." Chapter 6, The Warden's Fate. The spirits led Samuel and Sheriff Welker down to the first floor, past the cells to a narrow corridor ending in a heavy wooden door. Iron bands crossed it, secured by a rusted padlock. "The warden's quarters," Welker said. "Locked when they closed the jail. Never knew why." The spirits passed through the door like smoke. It swung open from inside with a groan. The room had served as both office and living space for Blackwood. A desk stood against one wall, papers scattered across its surface. A narrow bed in the corner. A bookshelf. The remnants of an abruptly ended life. But it was the opposite wall that drew Samuel's attention. The same pattern from the cells. The same seam. The same newer mortar. The same scratches. "No," Welker whispered. "Tell me that's not Blackwood," Samuel finished. "Someone sealed him in his own wall." The spirits drifted toward the sealed section, the air rippling with something like satisfaction. "The prisoners found out," one spirit said. "Not the ones in the walls, but the living ones. There was a fire in 1893. 3 prisoners escaped during the chaos. They found Blackwood trying to flee. Another continued, they dragged him back. Chained him like he'd chained us. Sealed him in his own wall while he screamed and begged. The prisoners were caught," a third added. "Hanged for murder. But not before they told the whole town what Blackwood had been doing. That's why the jail was closed. Not structural problems. Shame." "And Blackwood?" Samuel asked. "Still here. Still in his wall. Still suffering." Samuel approached the seal. Unlike the cells, this one was built stronger, double thickness with iron bands. The scratches were deeper, more frantic. Blackwood had lived longer than his victims, suffered more, died harder. "His body?" Welker asked. "More than his body," the first spirit said. "His soul. Trapped like ours were. But we were innocent, or our crimes didn't deserve this. He deserved every moment. And he's still experiencing it. Still dying. Still screaming in darkness. Forever." Samuel felt a chill unrelated to the supernatural cold. Forever? His spirit is still conscious? Still suffering? "Justice," a spirit said simply. "He documented our deaths clinically. Let him experience death eternally." Welker was examining Blackwood's desk. "Samuel. Look." Papers cover the surface, more ledger pages in Blackwood's handwriting, dated after the jail's official closing. September 19, 1893. "They've sealed me in. The prisoners who did this are dead, hanged. But they told the authorities everything before they died. The jail is closed. No one will come. I can hear them beyond the walls. The ones I killed. They're here. Waiting. September 22nd, 1893. 3 days. No water. My throat is dust. The spirits won't respond to my pleas. They just watch. 7 of them. Why 7? I killed 47. September 28th, 1893. Still alive. Impossible. The spirits won't let me die. Every time I slip toward unconsciousness, they pull me back. Force me to remain aware. To suffer. This is my punishment. Not death. Eternal dying. The entries grew more desperate, more incoherent. The last was dated October 15, 1893, over a month after he'd been sealed in. They're all here now. All 47. I can see their faces. William Morse. Sarah Coldwell. James Chen. Marcus Cole. All of them. They watch me suffer and don't speak and don't help, and they never leave, and I can't die, I can't die, I can't die, I can't. The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen having carved deep gouges into the paper. This is wrong, Samuel said quietly. What was done to those prisoners was evil. But this, keeping a soul trapped in eternal torment. The spirit's response was immediate. You don't understand. You had moments of our memories. We lived it for weeks. And now you want mercy for him? He who showed us none. I'm not asking you to free him, Samuel said carefully. I'm asking, what happens now? What do you want? The spirits were silent for a long moment. When they spoke, it was in unison, a chorus of the dead. We want what was taken from us. Light. Freedom. Peace. We want the world to know what happened here. We want justice not just for ourselves, but for him. They gestured toward Blackwood's wall, to know that his evil is exposed. That his name will be remembered with horror. We can do that, Welker said. We'll bring the state investigators. We'll exhume the bodies. We'll tell the newspapers. Everyone will know. And will you open his wall? A spirit asked, pointing at Blackwood's seal. Will you give him the mercy he denied us? Samuel and Welker exchanged glances. It was a test. A moral question with no right answer. No, Samuel said finally. I won't condemn a soul to eternal suffering, no matter what he did in life. That makes us no better than him. The spirits seemed to grow darker, more solid. The temperature dropped further. Samuel thought they might attack, might force him to experience more of their suffering. Then, slowly, they began to fade. We cannot leave this place, the first spirit said, its voice growing distant. We died here. We're bound here. But you can carry our story. Make sure we're not forgotten. Do that, and we'll accept what peace we can find. Wait, Samuel called. What about Blackwood? If I open his wall, will you? His fate is sealed, the spirit interrupted. By his own hand, by his own evil. We cannot free him even if we wanted to. His punishment is beyond our power to change. He chose his eternity when he chose his cruelty. Chapter 7, The Legacy of Stone. Samuel Garrett left Ashford's Creek 3 days later, but he never truly left the Harlow County Jail. It followed him in his dreams, in the sound of scratching he heard in every old building, in the way he flinched whenever he saw limestone walls. He kept his promise to the spirits. He brought state investigators who exhumed the bodies from the walls. All 47 victims were identified when possible, their names published in newspapers across Missouri. The story spread, the horror of Harlow County became a scandal that reached Washington. Officials resigned. The county's reputation was destroyed. But Samuel told the complete story to only one person, his colleague at the Historical Society, a man named Robert Chen, grandson of James Chen, one of Blackwood's victims. Samuel gave him every photograph, every note, every detail, including what couldn't be seen in pictures. The spirits. The eternal punishment. The scratching that never stopped. What about Blackwood's wall? Robert asked. Did you open it? No, Samuel said. And I told the investigators not to touch it. I said it was structurally unsound, that opening it might collapse the building. They believed me. So he's still there? Yes. Still dying. Forever. Samuel's hands trembled as he spoke. I know what he did was unforgivable. But condemning a soul to eternal suffering, I couldn't be part of extending that. I just couldn't open that wall. Robert was quiet for a long time. My grandfather died in those walls. Died scratching at stone while guards laughed. He was 23 years old, arrested for vagrancy because he was Chinese and in the wrong town at the wrong time. Do you know what my grandmother told me before she died? She said she still heard him scratching. At night. In the walls of her house. Until the day she died, she heard him. Samuel had no response to that. The jail was demolished 6 months later, in the summer of 1904. Samuel was not present for it, but he read the reports. The work crew refused to touch Blackwood's wall. 3 different foremen tried to order it done, and 3 different times the workers refused. Finally, they demolished the rest of the structure and left that one section standing, a single wall, 15 feet high, standing alone in the rubble. It stood for another year before someone finally tore it down in the middle of the night. No one claimed responsibility. When investigators examined the debris, they found no human remains inside the hollow space. No bones. No chain. Nothing. But the workers who demolished it reported hearing screams as the wall came down. Screams that cut off abruptly when the last stone fell. And then, in the sudden silence, a different sound. Laughter. Samuel received a letter about it from Sheriff Welker, who'd been present. I don't know if Blackwood finally found release, or if he found a way to escape, Welker wrote. But whatever was in that wall is gone now. I pray it's found peace. I pray we all can. Samuel never returned to Ashford's Creek. He continued his work documenting historical buildings, but he developed rules: never work alone, never open sealed spaces, never break down walls without knowing what they contained. His colleagues thought him paranoid. He never tried to explain. In 1912, 8 years after his experience at the jail, Samuel received a package with no return address. Inside was a small piece of limestone, roughly 4 inches square. One side was smooth and worked, clearly part of a wall. The other side bore scratches. Deep gouges made by human fingernails. And a note, written in handwriting Samuel didn't recognize: some walls protect us from what's outside. Some walls protect the outside from what's within. Be careful which ones you open. Samuel kept the stone on his desk for the rest of his life. A reminder. A warning. Sometimes, late at night when he was working alone, he would hear it. The faintest sound of scratching, coming from that small piece of limestone. Always just at the edge of hearing. Always just enough to make him wonder. He died in 1931, at the age of 69. His family found him in his study, slumped over his desk. The official cause was heart failure. But his daughter later reported that his face bore an expression of absolute terror, and his fingernails were broken and bloody, as if he'd been clawing at something. The limestone piece was gone. Despite searching the entire study, they never found it. But in the walls of Samuel's study, behind the bookshelf, investigators found something during the estate sale. Scratches. Deep gouges in the plaster. Fresh. Made recently. In a pattern that almost looked like words, if you knew how to read them. We never forget. We never forgive. We never stop. The house was demolished in 1932. The new owners of the land reported no unusual occurrences. But sometimes, people walking past the lot at night report hearing sounds. Scratching. Whispering. The rattle of chains. And if you press your ear against the ground where the house once stood, some say you can still hear them. All of them. The 47 victims. The warden. And Samuel Garrett himself. All of them scratching. Forever trying to break through walls that no longer exist. Because some prisons aren't built of stone and mortar. Some prisons are built of guilt, of trauma, of memories that never fade. And those walls are the hardest to escape. The Harlow County Jail is gone now. The town of Ashford's Creek is gone, absorbed into other municipalities. The records are scattered in archives across Missouri. Most people have forgotten what happened there in 1904. But the spirits haven't forgotten. They're still there, in that empty place where the jail once stood. Still contained by invisible walls. Still scratching. Still waiting. And every once in a while, someone new discovers the story. Opens the old files. Reads the accounts. Looks at Samuel's photographs. And when they do, they hear it. That night, in their own homes, in their own walls. Scratching. Because some stories don't want to be forgotten. Some horrors demand to be witnessed. And some walls, once opened, can never truly be sealed again. If you've listened this far, you've opened a wall yourself. You've let the story in. And now, tonight, when you're alone in the dark and you hear something in your walls, something scratching, something moving, you'll wonder. Is it just the house settling? Just the pipes? Just your imagination? Or did something follow you home from 1904? Listen carefully. You'll know soon enough. The end.